Good afternoon, Tommy, and good afternoon to all of the viewers. I'm not sure where people heard discarding. I didn't hear it at any point in any of the discussions. So I think they might be making up their own plans. As we've pointed out, we now have a level of uncertainty. Let's look at what the real situation is. In our COVID-19 vaccination strategy, we said we have to have a diversity of vaccines. One of those is AstraZeneca. The data on AstraZeneca were pretty good when we looked at prevention of hospitalizations and mild disease in the UK and in Brazil. Now we have some data. It's a small study, it's a limited study, but it suggests that it's not as effective against mild disease. But there were no hospitalizations, there were no severe disease. So it cannot make any conclusions on that. So we now are uncertain. Does this vaccine prevent hospitalization? And that's really important because that's what we're trying to achieve. So we said, let's think about how to establish that information. We don't want to end up giving 1 million people a vaccine that eventually we learn later doesn't prevent hospitalization. We need to do so as we do the rollout. And so we said, let's look at a 2-step rollout. We roll it out initially, assess what the hospitalization rates are, and if we're happy that it's within the range we would like to see, then continue rollout. No discussion of discard.
So what is the plan? Because what we are hearing is that now we're looking at the Johnson & Johnson vaccine while these further studies on the efficacy of AstraZeneca continue. What are the timings that we're talking about here?
So we are likely to see multiple vaccines enter. As I started off by explaining, we want to have a diversity of vaccines. And that's very important because if one vaccine turns out not to work against a new variant that's still to come, whereas others do, we have to make sure we have different vaccines that we're rolling out. And so they will become available at different times. Right now, we have AstraZeneca that's already landed in the country. We are expecting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine within the next few days. And once that becomes available, then the rollout of the Johnson & Johnson through an implementation program will begin. While we're working out the details of how to initiate the stepwise implementation rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine.
What is it that informed your choice of Johnson & Johnson vaccine? What is its efficacy rate against the South African strain specifically?
So when we look at the available evidence, on Sunday night, I tried to sort of encapsulate what we know. Right now, against the 501Y.V2 variant, there are 3 vaccines that have been tested. Novavax, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson. Now, with Novavax and with AstraZeneca, those studies were very small, and they only included young people. And so as a result, they can only really comment on diseases that are very mild. So that's mild infections. However, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine trial had a large sample size in South Africa. It also had 1/3 of the participants over the age of 65. So now we have a vaccine where we know its safety and its efficacy, both against severe disease and hospitalization. We now know in South Africa against 501Y.V2 variant that it's 85% effective against the severe forms of the disease. And it's a single shot. So that makes it a very good vaccine. It meets all of the criteria that we would like to see in a vaccine. And that's why it would be a high priority for South Africa. It should be pointed out that the Johnson & Johnson results have only just become available. It's barely, 2.5 weeks ago. So we didn't know whether Johnson & Johnson was effective until recently. Now that we've seen its results, it needs now to be approved by regulators, and then it can be rolled out in due course.
And what is its storage requirements?
So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has a huge advantage over many of the other vaccines. It's stored at normal fridge temperature, between 4 and 10 degrees. So I might not be exactly correct on that temperature because I haven't seen the latest data, but it's stored in a regular refrigerator. There's no special storage requirements. Most of our vaccines, routinely, we store them in a regular refrigerator.
I'd like to go back to the issue of Astrazeneca. A lot of South Africans are wondering what will happen to the Astrazeneca vaccine that we currently have in stock. We do understand that it has an expiry date of April, even though government was actually expecting the expiry date to be 6 months down the line. What is going to happen with this current batch that we've received?
So there seems to be some confusion about the expiry date issue. When you're dealing with a product that's only just been made, you do not have long-term stability data. In other words, you make a product like the AstraZeneca vaccine, and because you've only just been making it, you haven't yet tested whether it's stable for 6 months or 1 year. And so you can't give an expiry date that says it's still good if you use it a year later. So what do? The way you deal with it in any pharmaceutical is that the available stability period, in this case, it would be, say, 4 months or however long they have, that's the expiry date that they put on. That expiry date is actually a retest date. In other words, you then look at the newly available stability data because you're looking at stability over the long term. So now you might have stability data over 6 months or 8 months. Then you extend the expiry date. It's not changing anything. It's just that you haven't been able to study stability over the long term. And so you will expect, and we do that quite often in research when stability is not yet available for the long periods. So I'm expecting that the stability the data will become available and the retest date will then be pushed back. So that's how we'll probably have to deal with the existing stock.
We've heard Dr. Anban Pillay, Professor, say that contact will be made with the Serum Institute of India to see how this expiry date can be extended or if this vaccine will be taken back. How does that tie in with what you've said right now?
So any company that's manufacturing a product has to put an expiry date on the product. If it's a medication, it's a requirement. So the expiry date they put is based on the available evidence, right? And the only way you can collect that kind of stability evidence is that you assess the stability of the product and its makeup over time. Now, this vaccine hasn't even been manufactured. The first of this vaccine was only manufactured a few months ago. So you can't expect that we will know that it's stable for 1 year. That data will only become available. That study and that stability evidence has to come from the Serum Institute of India because they are the ones that manufacture it. They are the ones that have to do the stability studies. No one else can do that.
Professor, what is the overall impact of the delays and what we found out about AstraZeneca on the rollout process in South Africa? What is the long-term impact of that?
So there's two things that it impacts. The first is our original intention to start rolling out the first vaccines to healthcare workers was supposed to be in about a week's time, 10 days' time, I forget the exact date. So based on the expected arrival date of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's not clear whether we'll still be able to meet that timeline. It might be that timeline is either be met or might be pushed back a day or two, a few days. So the start date is going to be pushed back, maybe pushed back a few days. To me, that's not a big deal. The bigger issue is how can we ensure we have sufficient supplies of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? Because once we start, we have to scale up. And as we scale up and start giving more and more people vaccine, we need to ensure we have adequate supplies. Now, if we had the AstraZeneca vaccine being given out at the same time as the Johnson & Johnson, then we wouldn't be overly concerned, because if Johnson & Johnson vaccines are then no longer available, we've used up the available stock, then we would simply switch to AstraZeneca. Now we may not be able to do that. So it might impact the rate at which we scale up and the availability of vaccines in the scale up. So it's hard to predict whether that's actually going to occur, and if so, what its impact will be. But those are the two timelines that may be impacted by this new evidence that we're dealing with in relation to the AstraZeneca vaccine.
From the sounds of it, Professor Karim, it does sound like Johnson & Johnson is our solitary hope, what we are focusing on now as other studies on other vaccine options continue. What is the availability of Johnson & Johnson for us? I believe the first stock that we're getting is, how many? Is it 500,000?
I don't know the details. The Department of Health handles procurement. I have nothing to do with that. But you're actually touching on a key issue. There are 5 criteria when we look at a vaccine. Do we want this vaccine? Yes or no, based on 5 criteria. The first is safety. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been shown to be safe. Second, is it efficacious? Is it efficacious against our strain? Is it efficacious for severe disease and hospitalization? Is it efficacious against the elderly? Answer for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, yes. Is it a single dose or a double dose? We prefer single dose. So much easier, so much cheaper, more practical to implement. Johnson & Johnson, single dose. Next, we want to know, how easy is it to store and handle and manage? Answer to that, very easy. It's managed with simple refrigeration storage, which we use for other vaccines. And then finally, what is its cost? As it stands right now, its cost, I think, is at around $10, which makes it even cheaper than what we're paying for the AstraZeneca vaccine, for 2 doses of AstraZeneca vaccine versus 1 dose of Johnson & Johnson. So my 5 criteria that I've used, you can use those and you can judge any vaccine. And we've applied those criteria to each of the vaccines as we make a decision about which ones to include in our vaccination strategy.
The rollout of our vaccination strategy, how will that affect the anticipated 3rd wave?
So when we look at the way in which this virus has been, its dynamics and the way in which it comes and goes, we can expect in the course of 2021 to probably have 2 waves. The 3rd wave, probably in about 3 to 4 months' time. The gap between the waves is around that sort of time frame. And then probably another wave in the latter part of the year. So that's what we can expect. In order to make a significant impact on a wave, we would need to vaccinate very large proportions of our people. That would be almost undoable in the kind of timeframes we have. And in fact, that's probably undoable for almost all countries in the world, except perhaps for 1 or 2 like Israel, that has already vaccinated 90% of its elderly above 65. So in a smaller country like that, where you've got everybody in close proximity, you can do that, but there are very few other countries that can do that. The latest data we have seen from a study from the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene shows that even the UK, which is doing really well with their vaccine rollout, that they would not have vaccinated enough people by the time they get into their 3rd wave. And so there will be minimal impact on the 3rd wave from their vaccinations. And so we should expect the same. There's a big if in all of this. And this is a very big if. And that is that we don't know if we are going to have yet another new variant in the 3rd wave. Because if we do, then everything I've said to you is going to change, because a new variant may now be able to escape the vaccines that we're currently using. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And that's what's happened. In December last year, when we announced to the world that we had this new variant that could escape immunity, that was spreading faster, we basically were now announcing to the world that this idea that we would have this infection and we'd simply vaccinate everybody and it'll go away and that's, we can go back to living our lives. That's no more.
Is there a possibility, Professor, that even though one has taken, let's say, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that should there be another strain, then the individual who's already taken the Johnson & Johnson vaccine would then once again have to be vaccinated with the new vaccine? So that means that multiple or a number of vaccines in one individual. Is that a possibility? And, have there actually been studies done on, multiple vaccinations in the system as far as the health repercussions and implications of that?
Now, Tommy, you're the scientist here. You articulated it exactly correctly. So if you look right now, most of the pharmaceutical companies that have made vaccines are developing booster shots. The booster shot is based on the variant that we first described here in South Africa, the 501YV2 variant. Now, in making these booster shots, the whole idea is that the previous vaccines were based on the old variants, and so they protect against the old variants. This new booster shot will prevent and protect us from the new variant. And we're going to have to make booster shots as new variants come into play. And what we're now doing is laying the foundations for that. And that's what we are in the process. And so several of these companies, including Johnson & Johnson, are busy making these booster shots. It will take a bit of time, because they can't just be made overnight. They take a bit of time. So we'll expect them probably in around Q3, Q4. Some might come earlier. For example, Moderna might come a bit earlier because it's a bit faster to make an mRNA booster shot than it is to make an adenovector booster shot that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine comprises.
So let's look at a bit of scenario planning, Professor. Because we've got a limited number of Johnson & Johnson vaccines that have been procured and which will be coming into the country, those will go once again to the frontline workers. But once that particular shipment of Johnson & Johnson has been exhausted, what is going to happen to the rest of the healthcare workers who still remain unvaccinated? Will they then be given the Astrazeneca vaccine on the premise that AstraZeneca vaccine is better than no vaccine at all, or will they have to wait for another shipment and availability of Johnson & Johnson or any other of the vaccines that are found to be effective against the so-called South African strain?
Yeah, so that's the kind of question you'll have to ask the Department of Health that's managing the logistics of the actual implementation and rollout. They are the ones who actually have to run this program and make sure that vaccine supply meets vaccine demand. We as the scientific advisors, our task is to try and ensure that we are providing the latest scientific information to guide the decisions. So when a decision is being made to do X or Y, we're using the latest scientific evidence, and the evidence changes. I mean, if I had a discussion with you last week about AstraZeneca, it would be very different from a discussion this week. New evidence is emerging all the time. We don't know what new evidence will be available in a month's time, in 5 weeks' time. The situation is very fluid. To predict that now would be presumptuous.
Professor, we've got a couple of questions that are coming through on our social media platforms. If I may just place some of those to you and give you an opportunity to respond to some of the questions that we're getting on social media.
Sure.
Let's see if we can bring some of those up as we await. But one of the questions, literally, okay, here it is. It's from Mondli Dube, who says, if it's 78% inactive, why should it be used? I guess this is then in relation to the AstraZeneca vaccine. And it says, let us say they use it, then what will happen if it expires before it's being rolled out? And is it non-refundable? What if it has a severe side effects? What were the procedures or processes followed to secure the vaccine? That's one question coming from Mondli Dube. Well, it's a number of questions, but all really focusing around AstraZeneca.
Okay, so I think I've covered the questions already, but let me just reiterate, it might be helpful. When we are dealing with a medication, it's not like a loaf of bread where this is the expiry date, it's going to get moldy after that. It simply doesn't work like that. The way in which we work with medications, especially ones that have only just been manufactured, is that we take an expiry date that's a retest date. We assess the available information for a longer period, and so we extend the expiry date. So that's a very simple thing. We do it all the time in pharmaceutical industry, and so that's not an issue. I think what happened was that it wasn't explained in a very clear way, that it's not like the vaccine is going to get rotten on the date of the expiry. It doesn't work like that. Second is that when we talk about that the vaccine is only 22% efficacious, we are only talking about mild disease. And so that is not an efficacy that is meaningful to us. It's not helpful. In fact, it detracts us from what we really need. What do we need? We want to know what is the efficacy against hospitalization. That's what we want to know. Does it prevent hospitalization? Because we don't mind getting mild disease. We get mild colds, flus all the time. It's not a problem for us. We can deal with that. What we want is a situation that prevents hospitalization. There's a separate issue, which I'll come back to later. I won't complicate matters now, which is we also want a vaccine that prevents transmission. So even if you get a mild disease, we want to get it so that in a way that we're not spreading it, because spread is important. A vaccinated individual shouldn't spread the virus, but we don't know that for any of the vaccines at the moment. So I'll leave that aside. Just focus on what are we trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a situation where people do not get an illness from COVID that leads them into a situation where they have to go to hospital. That they get just a mild condition, they take a bit of, some tablets at home and a bit of painkillers and whatever else, and they're fine. So we need to know what is the efficacy. Can this vaccine prevent hospitalization? The answer to that is that the AstraZeneca vaccine prevents hospitalization against the old variants. But we don't know whether it does so for the new variants. So we are uncertain. It's not that we have that it's a bad vaccine or that it doesn't prevent disease. No, we don't know the answer. That's why we're saying the study to collect the information.
Professor, before I let you go, just to clarify, just because there's the new variant does not mean that the old variant or the original COVID-19 variant does not exist. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes, that is correct. We have in South Africa about 80 to 90% of our circulating viruses are the new variant, the 501YV2. The other variants comprise a very small proportion of our currently circulating viruses, about 10% or so.
Well, thank you so much. Always awesome talking to you. Great insight and a great level of understanding there. That's Professor Salim Abdool Karim. He chairs the President's Ministerial Advisory Committee